Everyone can tell how America seems to be going off the rails. As one woman mentions, society has drastically changed, as well as the fact that people are not as friendly or neighborly as they once were. Things weren't always this bad. In fact, in the 50s, things were a lot more peaceful and unified. Why people are less friendly and neighborly now is pretty obvious. We have gone from a community-based, high-trust society to an individualistic, more selfish, and low-trust society. I want to be clear though, embracing the community around you, trusting and liking your neighbors, does not take away from your individualism. Individualism is not fundamentally at odds with embracing your community. Bringing a pie, for example, to the couple that just moved in is a symbol that you are welcoming them to the community. It does not require you to give up your individuality to give a pie. Trust in others has also declined because people are not as involved in their local communities as they used to be. It's easier to trust the people around you when you know them well. There were all sorts of social things that people used to do together, like meeting at the local soda fountain or going to church together. People were not just united at the community level either. They had a broader thing to unite behind, a pride in their nation and the values that it stands for. Having similar values is the basic foundation of a society. When people don't have shared values, or really anything else in common, society as a whole begins to break down, and people begin to sort themselves into different groups. People used to be taught American values by their parents, by society itself, and the schools they went to as children. With a set of values that society at large agrees is both moral and necessary, for the most part this society will have little internal conflict, meaning people are cooperating together and crime is relatively low. There is also the popular saying about how if the youth of a community doesn't feel that they are a part of the community, they will burn it down just to feel the warmth of the fire. This is almost literally happening in certain places, where young criminals are rioting and burning down their own neighborhoods. Having an intact family is another foundation of society. A lot of the crime that is being committed now is done by men who grew up without a father in their lives. Just like how the bonds of the community have been undermined, family bonds have also suffered. Because of this, we now have the ridiculous term baby daddy for the men who have rejected the inherent responsibility they have to care for the children that they have fathered. You may have heard how both moral decay and decadence helped lead to the fall of Rome. As far as I can tell, both Rome and America had a sort of cultural decay, which resulted in things like a lack of shared identity and shared purpose. When you combine this cultural decay with a large amount of young elites knowing nothing but wealth and good times, the result of this is that traditional morality begins to gradually decline. This keeps going for a while, until it reaches a sort of tipping point, where there is a sudden and large-scale descent into depravity and hedonism. If I were to guess, I'd say that tipping point is when it becomes culturally normal for that behavior to happen. Hedonism is a sort of lifestyle that focuses on short-term pleasure and avoiding anything that might make you unhappy, like responsibility. The decline of morality in the U.S. is pretty significant. 83% of Americans polled in 2023 agreed that the morality of the country as a whole was getting worse. A society that has consistently declining morality will eventually devolve into decadence and hedonism. It doesn't take a philosopher or a holy man to notice the amount of people who are acting without morality. It doesn't take a criminal justice degree to notice that people are looting stores and using ideology to defend their actions afterwards. America used to be a much more religious place. The thing about religion is that it gives people a higher purpose and a sense of morality. Even if you're an atheist, you can understand why it would be good to have a populace that generally shares the same sense of morality and values. People will find different ways to justify their lack of morality. It's quite strange to hear someone advocating that you should live in a messy house and neglect your responsibilities to society as a whole. It's quite obvious that simply giving up on your commitments and responsibilities is self-sabotage. It will only harm you and the people that you care about. Peter Turchin has studied hundreds of complex societies to find out what causes them to break down and start what he calls disintegrative phases. Disintegrative phases, as the name suggests, are when the society starts to break down and is no longer unifying people like it should. Such disintegrative phases include social dysfunction, and in a worst-case scenario, this dysfunction can result in societal collapse. The reason America is in such a phase of disunity is because the previous elites have either died off or retired. The elites that replaced them had known nothing but good times and internal peace. Now these new elites want to exploit the system as much as possible to gain more money. The wealth pump, as Turchin calls it, is the method of taking wealth from the general population and giving that money to the elites. This chart demonstrates how worker productivity has increased greatly over the years, but wages have been basically flat. So basically, regular people are being screwed over and not being paid enough for the work that they do. You can understand this at the level of an individual business. The less money you pay your employees means more money that you can keep for yourself. Before I get too far into the weeds, I want to explain what exactly elites are. They are a very small amount of people who have a relatively large amount of power. As many would say, they are the top 1% of Americans. The act of denying people the money they are earning has very obvious consequences. Turchin explains that people are increasingly dying from what he calls immiseration. Immiseration is just a technical term that means people are becoming impoverished and made miserable. You may remember seeing these charts of both suicide deaths and drug overdose deaths rapidly and recently increasing. You may remember hearing about how the pandemic caused one of the greatest wealth transfers in human history. These charts are a great way to measure the amount of immiseration that is happening. There is a very human cost being paid here, and yet, for the large part, the government's response is inaction. In Canada, for example, those on disability generally don't get enough money from the government to live on. Because of this, they are effectively and artificially forced into poverty, and increasingly forced to consider assisted suicide. A system like this clearly doesn't value human life, and it shows the consequences of immiseration in a nutshell. Basic economics also tell us that globalization, like shipping American jobs overseas, unlimited mass immigration, and inflation all effectively keep your real wages from getting higher. And the reason, of course, that we have rampant inflation to begin with is because of irresponsible government printing money. So in my opinion, these things are all contributing to the wealth pump in some shape or form. Aside from immiseration, the wealth pump also has the effect of creating too many elites, what Turchin calls elite overproduction. Elite overproduction is simply too many people trying to become elites and not enough positions for all of those people. Universities, for example, make a lot of money when students go through law school. It is in their interest to have as many people become lawyers as possible. The amount of jobs available for lawyers is actually not that important to the university because they get the money and they're quite happy. So we end up with a lot of people trying to get into elite positions, failing to do so and becoming frustrated. This is one of the reasons we see so many people today with mediocre jobs, a degree, and a lot of college debt, because the position they wanted was just not available. Part of this blame also falls onto the individual, because there are a lot of people that are getting essentially useless degrees. So these people, who Turchin calls elite aspirants, end up getting very frustrated. It is this sort of people who become revolutionaries and radicals. Turchin explains that since so many people are immiserated, they see a college degree as the way out of that. And for a long time this was true, but now so many people have degrees actually just don't have the same value that they once had. This results in an increasing feeling that the social system is unjust. The idea that you are a victim of a social injustice begins to spread through these frustrated people. Then they feel the need to overthrow the current system. This partly explains why there are so many radicals these days talking about social justice and wokeness, why there are more people advocating for communism and rioting in a blind attempt to fight against a system that they don't like. Wokeness is an inherently authoritarian, cult-like belief system that is intended to throw out meritocracy. The end goal is to restructure society in a way that gives positions and power to the most fanatic believers, and of course those who have certain arbitrarily defined, diverse characteristics. This is very handy for certain people because they can now get positions that they wouldn't have gotten before when merit was the only determining factor. When talking specifically about politics, Turchin mentions how increased competition between groups of elites results in dirty tricks like character assassination instead of merit being used to get into positions. This quote I'm showing has some complex technical terms, but what he is talking about is groups of Democrat elites and Republican elites having a really no-holds-barred approach to politics. He also mentions that this sort of behavior is not limited to politics, but he really doesn't go into any detail. I want to be clear that polarization is being fueled quite directly by things like news media and social media as well. Turchin also points out that, historically speaking, elite overproduction typically ends in a generally unpleasant way that involves conflict and the removal of elites. Communist revolutions are a prime example of this sort of behavior, and if we can prevent such a thing from happening here, that's a very good thing. The funny thing about that is, those revolutionary communists who brought about the revolution to begin with are then immediately seen as a grave threat to the stability of the new communist government. However, it's totally possible that we can prevent such a bad outcome from occurring in the first place if we take a very deliberate approach to stopping the wealth pump that is causing these problems. Turchin mentions FDR's New Deal as a sort of historical example of how a wealth pump can be stopped with higher taxes on the rich and the general population getting paid more with a higher minimum wage. He also mentions that we live in modern times now, so we shouldn't just expect this exact solution to work in our current situation. So really, any sort of method that results in people getting paid appropriately for the work they do will solve this problem. Turchin mentions that competition between groups promotes cooperation. In times of war, for example, everybody unites together against a common enemy. Really, any sort of shared dysphoric experience, hardship essentially, can bring people together. Turchin also joked about how it would be a good idea to put politicians through a sort of boot camp to unify them and stop the polarization we have. The problem we have, though, is that Americans are currently too divided to be united by a national hardship. Both the pandemic and the current system of immiseration are clear examples of this. Turchin mentioned how he currently didn't see how someone was going to stop the wealth pump, as the problem being the left blames the right and vice versa. In my opinion, the way we have people work together across party lines is by getting them to work together on a task where politics is not involved. Heineken had a commercial called Worlds Apart where they demonstrated they could get two random people who fundamentally disagreed about a specific subject to sit down and have a regular conversation together. The way they did it was to have two people meet without knowing anything about each other and work together to assemble a bar. At the end of this task, each of the people were told about the vastly different position the other person had, yet they still sat down to have a beer together. Some people have proposed that we should have a sort of mandatory national service to bring people together working on various non-military projects together. I think that such a plan would be quite unpopular in practice, given how few people actually trust the government. What I think needs to happen is we get a non-profit organization to have a sort of voluntary program where people are given a bit of money in exchange for their time. Then we take people from across the political spectrum and get them working together on a project that is fundamentally good for the country. Off the top of my head, I think the first task should be to get the homeless and drug-addicted folks off the streets and into permanent housing. At some point, we explain to our participants what immiseration is and how it leads to people to losing hope, being addicted, and living on the streets, as well as the fact that we can work together to solve this problem before it really tears America apart. If anyone else has a better idea how to solve these problems, I'd be more than willing to hear it.